Chapter 1. A Child of Brittany, Marked by the Cross. The story begins in a small corner of Brittany, France. On February 12, 1850, in the rural village of Blaine near La Frodès, a child was born who would live a life unlike any other. Her name was Marie-Julie Jeheny. She came into the world as the eldest of 5 children, born to Charles and Marie Boyer Jeheny, humble peasants, hard-working and devout. Nothing in their modest home suggested that their daughter would one day bear the wounds of Christ and become known across Europe as the Breton stigmatist. From the very beginning, Marie-Julie's life carried a strange sense of destiny. At just a few years old, while kneeling in the village church, she heard a voice that no one else could hear. It called to her gently, "Stay a little longer with me." That invitation, whispered from the depths of the tabernacle, marked her forever. Unlike most children, Marie-Julie was irresistibly drawn to silence, prayer, and long hours before the Blessed Sacrament. She was not unsociable. She played with her brothers and sisters, helped her mother with the housework, and did her share of labor on the family farm. But her heart already seemed to belong elsewhere. The village would later remember her as modest, punctual, and radiant with a kind of purity beyond her years. By the time she reached adulthood, she had entered the Third Order of St. Francis, dedicating herself to a life of humility and penance. Yet her true mission had not even begun. The Stigmata, a soul wounded by heaven. In 1873, when she was 23 years old, everything changed. Marie-Julie fell gravely ill. On February 22nd, the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to her, announcing that she would suffer greatly in her life, not for herself, but for the salvation of sinners. Weeks later, on March the 15th, Our Lady asked if she was willing to endure the very torments of Christ's Passion. Marie-Julie, without hesitation, said yes. Then the impossible happened. On March 21st, 1873, she received the stigmata, the visible wounds of Christ's crucifixion imprinted on her own flesh. First, the 5 wounds, hands, feet, and side. Soon after came the marks of the crown of thorns, the scourging of the back, and wounds on her shoulders where Christ bore the cross. In time, even a mysterious ring appeared on her finger, a mark of mystical espousal, signifying that she had become the spiritual bride of Christ. Doctors, priests, and bishops came to witness. They saw with their own eyes what she described, radiant wounds of Christ appearing in light, then striking her body, opening into bleeding marks that never healed, yet never decayed. Dr. Imbert Gourberet, a skeptical professor of medicine, examined her carefully. He could find no fraud, no natural explanation. He declared her case genuine. Even more extraordinary, in December of 1873, she received a cross and flower marked on her chest, with the Latin words, O crux ave, hail to the cross. Witnesses reported a fragrance of heavenly perfumes filling the room as this mark appeared. From that day forward, her Fridays became days of agony. The wounds bled, the pain overwhelmed her, and yet she bore it all in silence. Unlike ordinary wounds, hers never grew infected. The blood flowed, but her body remained strangely sustained. It was as though she was being preserved for a divine purpose. The victim soul, Marie-Julie, understood her mission with a clarity that frightened those around her. She was to be a victim soul, someone chosen by God to suffer voluntarily for the sins of others. In a world rushing toward disbelief, revolution, and war, her pain would serve as a silent intercession. Her torments were not limited to the stigmata. At times, she would lose her voice, hearing, or sight. Her limbs would become rigid, her body cold as stone, until suddenly released during ecstasies. She endured violent assaults from unseen forces. Witnesses saw bruises appear on her skin, objects thrown across her room, rosaries snapped apart by invisible hands. Marie-Julie insisted it was the devil himself, furious at her mission. And yet she remained steadfast. She once declared, "If by my death I could save a single soul, I would gladly die 1,000 times." A life of signs and wonders. Those who came to La Frodès witnessed more than suffering. Crucifixes in her room were seen to bleed. Religious pictures wept blood. She survived for months and even years on nothing but the Holy Eucharist. And when the local bishop, suspicious of her visions, forbade her the sacraments, heaven provided in another way. Witnesses testified that on certain mornings, hosts would appear miraculously, placed upon her tongue by an unseen hand. Whether one believed or doubted, there was no escaping the fact. Something supernatural surrounded her. The mission begins. It was within these ecstasies, visions that could last for hours, that Marie-Julie began to speak prophecies. Often her voice would change, her words rising with solemn power. Priests and lay people wrote them down, line by line. Her prophecies warned of terrible chastisements, wars, natural disasters, and above all, a coming period of darkness, both spiritual and literal, that would shake the entire world. She foretold the rise of corrupt priests, the betrayal of the church from within, the downfall of nations, and the punishment of France. But she also foretold hope. She spoke of a great monarch who would rise in France, guided by heaven, alongside a holy angelic pontiff who would restore the Catholic Church to glory. To those around her, Marie-Julie Jahenny was no longer just a mystic girl from a Breton village. She had become a living sign, a messenger carrying both warning and promise. Chapter 2. Visions of a World. In darkness, as the years passed, Marie-Julie Jahenny's life became inseparable from her visions. She no longer belonged fully to this world. Witnesses noted the strange transformation in her voice during these trances. The simple Breton peasant girl who had little education would suddenly speak with the eloquence of a theologian, quoting scripture, describing the lives of saints, and unveiling future events with a clarity that unsettled even the learned priests who listened. Much of what she saw revolved around her homeland. France, once called the eldest daughter of the Church, was central to her mission. But in her visions, Christ lamented that France had abandoned him. She foresaw revolutions, civil strife and bloodshed, where the blood of Christians would mingle with that of the impious. Again and again she was told that France would first be chastised, then renewed. Paris, the proud city, would suffer terribly. She saw storms of fire, uprisings in the streets, and churches profaned. In one vision she described Paris as a city swallowed in flames, her monuments crumbling, her people scattering. But the punishment was not only for France. She spoke of punishments that would reach across Europe and into distant nations, wars, plagues, and strange diseases unknown to mankind. She foresaw a future where whole regions would be left desolate, their populations reduced by famine and violence. The betrayal within the church. Marie-Julie warned of a time when false pastors would rise, priests who appeared holy but betrayed their flock. She described a counterfeit mass, a liturgy altered and stripped of its sacredness, containing words offensive to Christ. For her, this was not merely ritual change, but a grave offense that would open the way for deception. She saw altars abandoned, tabernacles desecrated, and faithful priests driven into hiding. In her visions, the faithful remnant would have to cling to tradition, even if the visible structures of the church seemed consumed by corruption. Rome, she once declared in ecstasy, will be invaded by the forces of darkness. The storm there will be blacker than the storm in France. Some would later interpret her words as predicting the modern crises of faith and division within the church. The coming chastisements. Her visions painted a bleak picture of what lay ahead. Entire regions would be devastated in hours. There would be new plagues that spread rapidly, striking down thousands before doctors could even give them a name. She described blood rain that would fall for weeks, poisoning the land and the rivers. And then there was the darkness. The days of darkness. Among her most famous prophecies are those of the 2 days of darkness and the more terrifying 3 days of darkness. She said that before the great chastisement, there would be a lesser trial, 2 days where the sun would be veiled, plunging the earth into unnatural gloom. This would be a prelude, a warning to humanity that the hand of judgment was near. But the greater terror was yet to come. The 3 days of darkness, she foretold, would descend suddenly, after years of growing sin and rebellion. But she also insisted that this was not the end. The darkness would pass, And with it, a new dawn of renewal would come, a rebirth of faith unlike any the world had seen. This renewal, she prophesied, would come through two figures, a great monarch and an angelic pontiff. She described the monarch as a king chosen by God, one descended from the line of martyrs, perhaps from the royal house of France. This king, she said, would come from exile, rise in the midst of chaos, and restore order not only to France, but to much of Christendom. He would govern with justice, defend the church, and crush the enemies of the faith. Alongside him would rise a pope of extraordinary holiness, the angelic pontiff. Together, they would guide the church and the world into a new era of peace, faith, and divine favor. To a people worn down by visions of disaster, these promises were a glimmer of hope. Marie-Julie did not leave her listeners in despair. She showed them that even after the greatest darkness, renewal would come. The urgency of warning. One phrase echoed again and again through her ecstasies: "I do not want my people to be surprised." Christ, speaking through her, warned that humanity must not be caught unaware. The chastisements would not come without warning. Signs would be given in the sky, in the earth, and in the collapse of nations. She saw storms gathering over the earth, and she begged her listeners to prepare, not with fear, but with faith. Chapter 3. Remedies for the chastisements. Amid Marie-Julie's terrifying visions, she also offered instructions, strange, almost apocalyptic remedies said to come directly from heaven. To her followers, these were not curiosities but lifelines, protections meant to carry the faithful through the darkest days humanity would ever endure. The blessed wax candles. Perhaps the most famous of these remedies concerns the 3 days of darkness. Marie-Julie insisted that during those 72 hours, when the world would be plunged into unnatural night and demons would roam the earth, no artificial light would shine except for candles made of pure, blessed wax. Oil lamps, electricity, and ordinary candles would all fail. Only those specially prepared candles would burn. The instructions were chillingly specific. Once the darkness began, every window must be covered. And no one was to look outside, no matter what they heard. The doors must remain locked. And families were to gather in prayer, trusting that the light of the candle and the grace of God would protect them. The candle itself was not magical. It was a symbol, a sign of divine light shining amid hell's fury. Those who mocked the remedy, she warned, would find themselves lost. Marie-Julie repeatedly emphasized that in the days of trial, no weapon would save mankind, only prayer. She urged the faithful to cling to the rosary and to keep a crucifix close at hand. She described homes where the rosary was prayed as being encircled by invisible walls of protection. Demons, no matter how numerous, could not cross the threshold. The rosary, she said, would be the chain that binds the enemy. Another protection was holy water. In her ecstasies, she saw devils fleeing at the mere sprinkling of it. She urged priests and laity alike to keep holy water always near. She also stressed the importance of sacramentals, blessed medals, crucifixes, scapulars. These objects, humble though they were, carried a spiritual defense. Perhaps the most unusual part of her message concerned the use of certain plants and herbs. She revealed that heaven had given natural remedies for coming plagues and diseases. Among them were St. John's wort, said to be a safeguard against unknown fevers; hawthorn leaves and blossoms, to be used in an infusion against sudden chest ailments and respiratory sicknesses; purple vervain, described as a protection in times of pestilence. Marie-Julie insisted that when modern medicine failed against new and terrifying illnesses, these humble herbs, blessed and used with prayer, would bring relief. She was also clear: the remedies were not for profit or superstition. They were gifts of mercy entrusted to her so the faithful would not be left defenseless. In one of her visions, she spoke of a time when food would be scarce. She advised families to keep bread and water blessed, saying they would last far longer than naturally possible, sustaining those who trusted in God. Just as she offered protections, she also warned against deceptions. She saw visions of people running after new medicines, new inventions, and new promises of safety offered by the world. But these would fail. The only sure protection, she insisted, was the one heaven had revealed. The somber refrain, "We are warned," in her ecstasies, she often repeated Christ's words. "I do not want my people to be surprised. I want them to be warned." The message was clear. The world was moving toward chastisement, but heaven had already provided the means to endure it. Even skeptics who doubted her visions admitted the power of her presence. In a sense, her entire life was itself a remedy, a living example of how to remain faithful in an age of darkness. Chapter 4. Shadows that came true. Prophecy is often dismissed as superstition, the fever dream of the fearful. But Marie-Julie Jahenny's followers pointed to events that seemed to confirm her visions. Over and over, the world unfolded along the path she had described. Storms of war, upheaval in the church, and signs in nature that echoed her warnings. One of the first fulfilled prophecies was almost hidden in its simplicity. In 1874, during one of her ecstasies, Marie-Julie spoke of a great road that would pass near her home in La Fraudaise. A strange prediction, since the tiny hamlet was rural and remote. Years later, a railway line was built there, cutting through the very fields she had described. To the faithful, it was proof that her visions touched reality. More ominous were her prophecies of war. In 1881, she spoke of a great conflict that would engulf all of Europe, spreading like wildfire across nations. She described it as a terrible conflagration, where millions would perish and nations would be overturned. When the First World War erupted in 1914, her words were remembered with dread. She had warned of fields littered with corpses, rivers running red with blood, and mothers weeping for sons who would never return. Even more chilling was her prophecy in 1939, just 2 years before her death. She foretold another worldwide fire, greater than the first. This second war, she said, would be more destructive, involving not only Europe but distant nations across the globe. It was a war of machines and fire in the sky, an uncanny description of aerial bombings, which devastated entire cities during World War II. Marie-Julie also described natural upheavals, storms, floods, and earthquakes. She saw lightning splitting cities apart, seas flooding coastlines, and lands consumed by fire. She warned that France itself would suffer under storms and plagues. While skeptics argued these were common fears of the 19th century, her followers pointed to the uncanny detail, specific storms and disasters that matched her descriptions, sometimes years after she spoke them. One striking example was her mention of blood rain, a terrifying image of red-colored rain that would poison the land. While her prophecy suggested a supernatural chastisement, people later connected it with real phenomena. Rains tinged red by Saharan dust or volcanic ash, which occurred in parts of Europe in the 20th century. Another fulfilled prophecy was more intimate but no less chilling. She foresaw a time when the Blessed Sacrament, the very heart of Catholic worship, would be desecrated, abandoned, and trampled underfoot. In her day, such a thought was unthinkable. Yet in the 20th and 21st centuries, reports of stolen consecrated hosts, satanic desecrations, and churches left abandoned seemed to echo her warnings. The more her words seemed to align with history, the more her reputation spread beyond her little village. Pilgrims came from across France, and eventually from around the world, to hear about the Breton mystic who spoke of both doom and hope. Chapter 5. The 3 Days of Darkness. Among all the warnings spoken by Marie-Julie Jahenny, none left a deeper mark than her prophecy of the 3 Days of Darkness. It was the vision that would echo through Catholic prophecy for more than a century, inspiring fear, preparation, and endless debate. She first described a shorter darkness, 2 days when the sun would grow dim and the sky would veil itself in an unnatural shadow. This, she said, would be a warning, a sign that the greater chastisement was near. Those who ignored it, she warned, would be swept away when the final hour arrived. Then came the vision that chilled even her closest followers. She saw a time when the sins of humanity would reach such a point that heaven would no longer hold back judgment. Suddenly, without warning, a thick darkness would fall over the entire world. For 3 days and 3 nights, the sun would not rise, the stars would vanish, and the earth would be shrouded in a night blacker than any natural shadow. This was no eclipse, no storm. It was a supernatural event, a plague of darkness recalling the punishments of Egypt, but far more terrible in scope. During those hours, the earth itself would seem to groan. Marie-Julie spoke of horrifying sounds that would fill the air, thunder without clouds, the shrieking of demons, cries of the damned roaming through the streets. The wind would howl like a beast, carrying voices that tempted the faithful to look outside. But the greatest danger was not the storm, but the presence of the demonic. She warned that during those days, the gates of hell would be thrown open. Legions of demons, once chained, would be loosed upon the earth, entering homes, tearing apart souls who had not prepared. It was a nightmare unlike any the world had imagined, not merely a natural disaster, but the very invasion of hell into human history. The rules of silence. The instructions were stark. Windows must remain shut and covered. No one was to look outside, for to behold the chaos would mean certain death. Doors must remain locked. Even if voices of loved ones called from outside, they were not to be opened, for demons would mimic the cries of family and friends, luring the faithful to their doom. Candles of blessed wax would be the only light. No other flame, no lamp or fire would burn.
Prayer must not cease. She warned, "The air will be infected with demons. My children, do not open your doors, for those who look outside will die instantly."
The harvest of judgment. The cost would be staggering. Marie-Julie claimed that the majority of mankind would perish during these 3 days. Cities would collapse. The wicked would be swept away, burned in firestorms or seized by demons. Animals too would be struck down, leaving the earth silent in their absence. And yet, amid the terror, a remnant would survive, those who prayed, who trusted, who obeyed the instructions given. When the 3 days ended, she saw the world reborn in silence. The air would clear, the sun would rise again, and the survivors would emerge from their homes into a land forever changed. The wicked would be gone. Entire nations would lie in ruins. But the faithful remnant would begin again, guided by heaven, led by the promised great monarch and angelic pontiff. For them, the chastisement would become the threshold of a new era of peace and faith. To those who heard her speak, this prophecy was terrifying but unforgettable. It spread far beyond La Fraudaise, carried in whispers, copied in pamphlets, and retold in sermons. Even today, the prophecy of the 3 days of darkness is remembered in Catholic circles, debated, doubted, but never entirely dismissed. But Marie-Julie Jahenny was not alone in these warnings. Across centuries, other mystics and visionaries also spoke of a terrible period of darkness that would cleanse the world. Blessed Anna Maria Taigi, a Roman housewife and mystic of the early 19th century, gave one of the earliest and most vivid descriptions. She foretold 3 days of supernatural night, during which only blessed wax candles would give light, while demons and punishments would descend upon the earth. Later, Padre Pio, the Capuchin friar and stigmatist, echoed the same warning in letters and testimonies, urging the faithful to prepare with prayer and candles blessed by a priest. In Italy, Elizabeth Canori Mora, another mystic, spoke of storms, plagues, and divine chastisements that closely resemble Marie-Julie's visions. Even outside the canonized mystics, the prophecy persisted. Alois Erlmeyer, a 20th century German visionary, predicted global conflict followed by days of total darkness, when survival would depend on faith and preparation. These voices, scattered across countries and centuries, describe the same chilling pattern: an unnatural darkness, a demonic presence loosed upon the earth, and a divine purification that would leave only a faithful remnant to begin anew. The chosen king. She described the great monarch as a king hidden in obscurity, born of royal blood, yet living in exile until the appointed time. He would not rise by his own ambition, but by the will of heaven. According to her visions, France, the land she loved, the land once called the eldest daughter of the Church, would be the soil from which this king would arise. He would descend from the line of martyrs, possibly connected to the House of Bourbon, and carry within him the legacy of saintly rulers of the past. When he came, it would be at the moment of France's greatest collapse, a time when revolution, bloodshed, and persecution had left the nation desolate. He would appear suddenly, rallying the faithful, defeating the forces of evil, and restoring order. His reign would not be a tyranny of power, but a reign of justice, guided by the cross. Marie-Julie foresaw him as a champion of the Church, defending her against enemies within and without. His sword, she said, would be wielded not in conquest for himself, but in protection of the faith. For France, this meant restoration, but not without cost. The nation would suffer chastisement, blood and near destruction before the king arose. Only after the storms and darkness would the land be purified enough to welcome its chosen ruler. Yet the promise extended beyond France. For her followers, these visions provided a necessary balance to her darker warnings. If the chastisements were unavoidable, at least they were not the end. The story of the world was not one of destruction alone, but of rebirth. Marie-Julie gave hints but never dates. She saw enough to inspire faith, but not enough to satisfy curiosity. The vision was not meant to be a riddle to solve, but a call to readiness, to keep watch for the hand of God in history. Chapter 6: The Final Years and a Lasting Legacy. Marie-Julie Jahenny's life was one of suffering and vision, but it was also a life of remarkable endurance. By the early 20th century, she had become known simply as the Woman of La Fraudaise. Pilgrims journeyed from across France and beyond to the little Breton village, seeking to hear her words, to pray in her presence, or to witness her extraordinary ecstasies. She remained poor, humble, and hidden. She never sought wealth, never asked for payment, and never sought to draw attention to herself. Her life was entirely bound to her mission, to suffer, to warn, and to intercede. When World War II erupted, her words seemed to take on a terrifying clarity. Those who remembered her prophecies could not help but see them reflected in the horrors unfolding around them. At last, after nearly 70 years of bearing the stigmata, Marie-Julie Jahenny's long life of suffering came to an end. On March 4, 1941, she died quietly in her home at La Fraudaise. She was 91 years old. Her body, marked for decades with wounds that mirrored Christ's passion, was laid to rest in the cemetery of her parish church in Blaine. Those who had followed her regarded her death not as an end, but as a passing into the embrace of the one she had suffered for. After her death, devotion to Marie-Julie did not fade. Many regarded her as a saint, even though the church never formally opened her cause for canonization. While local clergy supported her during her life, official recognition never came. Whether one accepts or doubts her visions, one thing remains undeniable: her life was extraordinary. In her final years, she summed up her mission with quiet simplicity. "I suffer so that souls may be saved. This is my only desire." History is filled with voices like hers, voices from the margins warning of truths too easily forgotten. And here on this channel we continue to explore them, the mysteries, the prophecies, the shadows that shape our world. If you found this video meaningful, please give it a like to help others discover it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey into the hidden and the unknown. And as always, thank you for watching.